frenzy of werewolf accusations began in the 1400s during the Valais witch trials. Although 1521 marked the first werewolf trial, accusations of shapeshifting on a mass scale started even earlier. The Valais witch trials began in 1428, and over the course of decades, found dozens if not hundreds of people guilty of sorcery, witchcraft, and werewolfery. They were all tortured, and most were beheaded and burned at the stake. The executions were ruthless. The accused were tied to ladders with a sachet of gunpowder tied around their necks, after which they were tipped into a blazing fire. Although burning witches and werewolves at the stake wasn't a new thing, these trials were extraordinary because of the sheer amount of people accused, and because of what was happening to the nobility at the time. Unfortunately, the reasons for the trials wasn't due to a sudden uptick in sorcery, witchcraft, or werewolf activity. It was because of political upheaval. The entire Valais region was relatively new, and control of those lands were highly contested. In order to solidify the holdings of the lords, the trials were held. Those who were accused and found guilty automatically forfeited their land to the lord vassal. Because this tactic worked incredibly well for the Valais noblemen, the Holy Roman Empire attempted a similar strategy nearly a century later with the werewolf witch trials. Those trials plagued Europe for nearly 3 centuries before the barbaric practice came to an end. The werewolf trials were fueled by the Church's need to bolster its waning influence. During the handful of centuries the werewolf trials took place, Europe was in a pretty bad way. The Protestant Reformation was sweeping through the land and threatening the power of the papacy in Rome. Religious conflicts dotted Europe and fractured the Holy Roman Empire, which eventually culminated into the 30 Years' War in the early 17th century. Because the Church was losing so much influence, they turned to an age-old practice to bolster their ranks, the subsumption of local religions. The Church turned local gods into saints, and they also turned the more animalistic beings from the smaller religions into creatures influenced by the devil. So when people and livestock turned up dead, and when crops failed en masse, it became commonplace for these churches to interrogate, judge, and execute werewolves and witches who confessed to their crimes. All levels of these trials were often brutal. Extreme torture was used during interrogations, and it was standard practice to burn the guilty at the stake. Many of the condemned werewolves were likely suffering from severe mental illness.
Clinical lycanthropy is a condition where a person believes they are able to transform into a feral beast, such as a wolf or other predator. Dr. Jan Dirk Blom studied clinical lycanthropy in 1850 and found at least 13 cases where people identified as transforming into a wolf over a 150-year period. Although rare, it was certainly enough to link them all together as a common mental illness. And it wasn't the first time lycanthropy was noted as a form of insanity. The condition was noted as far back as the 7th century by physician Paul of Aegina. Aegina noted some people suffered from an animalistic dissociation from humanity.
The werewolf of Caud was found guilty of murder and locked in a sanitarium.
In 1598, just outside of Angers, France, hunters discovered the body of a badly mutilated teenager and chased off the wolf, eating it. The hunters followed the trail of blood, and instead of a wolf, they found Jacques Roulet, the werewolf of Caud. He was naked, covered in blood, and held pieces of human flesh in his hands. They immediately took him into town, where he was promptly arrested and tried for his horrendous crime. After the customary period of torture, Roulet confessed to having the ability to transform into a werewolf. According to Roulet's confession, he had been able to transform into a wolf since he was a child, thanks to a salve his parents gave him. Roulet was found guilty of murder and cannibalism and sentenced to death. However, his case was quickly appealed. The courts found that he was actually just insane and not a werewolf and locked him away in a sanitarium for his malicious deeds.
Thiess of Kaltenbrun was a werewolf who fought witches and devils.
In 1692, an 80-year-old man by the name of Thiess openly confessed to being a werewolf without the prerequisite torture session. During his trial, he claimed werewolves were the hounds of God who routinely went into hell to combat demons and witches. They also brought back the earthly goods demons had stolen from the people. Thiess went as far as to admonish a priest, claiming his work as a werewolf was far more godly than anything the priest had done. The church was aghast. For centuries their narrative was dependent on the fact werewolves were the devil's playthings. By that point, they had run tens of thousands of trials all over Europe condemning confessed werewolves, most of whom were put to death brutally. But Thiess wasn't burned to death at the stake. Instead, his punishment was 10 lashes. He was banished from the church, as the judge did not buy his good werewolf bit.
Gilles Garnier was burned at the stake for cannibalizing children.
Gilles Garnier was burned at the stake for cannibalizing children. The werewolf of Chalonss's crimes were so horrifying he was erased from all records after his trial. Pierre de Lancre was the righteous psychopath King Henry Roman IV put in charge of ending witchcraft and lycanthropy. The werewolves of Poligny were serial killers who targeted and murdered children.
The werewolf of Bedburg had his skin peeled off with hot pokers and his limbs broken.
The werewolf of Bedburg had his skin peeled off with hot pokers and his limbs broken.
Hey guys, thank you so much for the support and likes and comments down below, and also thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to see you in the next video. Then take care, bye.